Summer, 1943. A faint dawn mist lingers over the Baltic pine woods. The iron rails that cut through the forest glisten with dew, an ordinary load line on the surface, but beneath it, a hidden front line. In the silence before sunrise, a handful of partisans lie pressed to the ground, listening for the distant hum of an approaching train. One twist of wire, one charge under a steel joint, and the quiet forest will erupt into the sound of war. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, had endured one occupation after another. First, the Soviets in 1940, then the Germans after the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. By 1943, the region had become a critical route for the German Eastern Front. Railways carried food, fuel, ammunition, and the wounded between the front lines and the rear depots. The Wehrmacht depended on these lines more than ever, as its supply system stretched thin. Every bridge, every length of track threading through the forests was a lifeline, and therefore a target. To the occupiers, the forest was an obstacle. To the resistance, it was a shelter. The woods were thick enough to hide men, weapons, and messages. Across the Baltic countryside, small groups of saboteurs began to emerge, former soldiers, rail workers, and ordinary villagers bound by a simple goal: to make the rails unsafe. These were not the large partisan brigades that operated in Belarus or Ukraine, but tiny, mobile cells. They struck at night, vanished by morning, and left behind wrecked sleepers, severed telegraph lines, and confusion that rippled for miles. German occupation forces ruled with rigid efficiency. Garrisons and field police patrolled the tracks, and collective punishment was common when sabotage occurred. Still, resistance networks grew in the shadows. In rural stations, sympathetic railway employees misdirected supplies, passed schedules to partisans, or left keys to depots where explosives were stored. Blacksmiths forged primal tools for bending rails. Farmers offered barns as hideouts. Information moved in whispers, always by trusted hands, never on paper. By mid-1943, word spread of a new Soviet directive known as the Rail War. From Moscow, partisan headquarters urged local resistance across occupied Europe to target railway lines, feeding the German front. In the Baltic region, the order travelled slowly through forest networks and sympathizers, who risked execution for mere contact. For those already resisting, it confirmed what they had long understood, that rails were the enemy's veins. Cut them, and you starve the front. The geography of the Baltics shaped everything. Railways crossed low wetlands, pine ridges, and vast stretches of uninhabited forest. There were a few main lines. Damage to even a single bridge could halt movement across hundreds of kilometers. German repair crews could rebuild within days, but only if they could reach the site, and only if the saboteurs did not return first. The forest allowed no clear front line. A train that left Riga in safety might vanish before reaching Pskov. The Germans called it the Green Corridor, a euphemism for the deadly uncertainty of Baltic transport. In Estonia, small sabotage teams formed around towns like Tartu and Narva. In Latvia's hinterlands, groups hid in boggy terrain near Valmiera and Madona, using canoes to cross flooded plains. Lithuania's resistance, more fragmented, relied heavily on sympathetic villagers near the Šiauliai rail junction, where supplies to the northern front converged. A few of these people considered themselves soldiers. Many were simple citizens who had seen enough of foreign occupation. But the forest gave them purpose, and the rails gave them leverage. Sabotage began crudely. A loosened bolt, a spiked plank, a short section of track removed under cover of darkness. At first, German patrols dismissed such acts as mischief. But when trains began derailing in multiple regions, when entire stretches of telegraph wire disappeared, Berlin took notice. Countermeasures followed. Armed guards on flat cars, increased patrols, curfews in nearby villages. Still, every new safeguard required men, fuel, and time resources already stretched by the war in Russia. For the saboteurs, every success carried danger. When a supply train derailed near Jelgava in late 1943, German forces burned nearby farms in reprisal. Dozens of civilians were arrested. Yet, the attacks continued. One Latvian rail worker later recalled, "We learned to hide in the smoke of our own fires. If they thought we feared them, they would have won twice." Such voices rarely appear in official archives, but their stories survived in family memory, told quietly through generations. By autumn, the forests had grown colder and wetter. Sabotage teams learned to work with precision, counting the wheels of cargo cars to judge where to place charges, memorizing timetables stolen from station offices, measuring seconds between detonations. The explosives were often improvised, salvaged munitions, railway detonators, or handmade devices with scrap metal casings. The aim was never to destroy an entire train, but to halt it, delay it, force a response that rippled backward along the network. Each hour of stoppage was a small victory, invisible in the grand maps of the Eastern Front, but deeply felt by every German supply officer waiting for ammunition that never arrived. The Germans fought the forest as if it were an enemy itself. Patrols swept through villages, cutting paths through undergrowth to expose hidden camps. Engineers built small blockhouses near bridges and stationed guards at critical junctions. Yet the longer the occupation lasted, the more the occupiers depended on the very locals they feared. Rail maintenance required local labor. Transport of timber and coal relied on Latvian and Estonian drivers. The line between forced worker and secret saboteur blurred. A man might repair a track by day and remove a bolt from it by night. The forests heard both languages' German commands echoing from armored trains and the hushed speech of those who resisted them. The tension was constant. For every partisan cell that escaped detection, another was crushed. But the movement endured because it was dispersed. When one group was destroyed, others absorbed its members or took its place. Communication was minimal by design. If one cell was caught, it could not betray another. As 1943 turned toward winter, the Germans felt pressure from all sides. Soviet offensives in the east, Allied bombing in the west, and, across the Baltic interior, a war of rails that seemed endless. The resistance understood that each act of sabotage was part of something larger, even if they could not see it. They fought not only for military effect, but for proof that occupation could be resisted. In the early hours of one foggy morning, a German troop train left the station at Daugavpils, loaded with reinforcements for the front near Leningrad. It never reached its destination. Several kilometers down the line, where the track curved through dense pine, an empty stretch waited. The rails had been cut, their joints carefully loosened, and the sleepers hollowed with small explosive charges. When the locomotive reached the gap, it jumped the rails, screeched, and toppled into the embankment. The forest swallowed the noise quickly. By dawn, only smoke rose through the trees, and the partisans were already gone. But success had a price. German units explored the surrounding villages within hours. Whole families were rounded up for questioning. The occupation authorities declared new restrictions, more patrols, and collective punishment for future attacks. For those who had watched the explosion from afar, the feeling was mixed. Pride and fear intertwined. They knew what the next days would bring. Still, the forest whispered with quiet defiance. Each broken rail became a message, carved into the logistics of empire. We are still here. And as the Germans strengthened their grip on the railways, the saboteurs prepared to strike again, now with guidance from a new campaign spreading across the east, one that promised to turn the occupiers' greatest strength into their most fragile weakness. The rail war had reached the Baltic forests, and the saboteurs were ready to answer its call. By mid-1943, the German occupation of the Baltic lands had settled into a harsh rhythm. Garrisons guarded the towns, patrols scoured the countryside, and trains rumbled endlessly eastward, each a lifeline to the collapsing Eastern Front. Yet behind the apparent order, quiet plans were taking shape. Deep in the forests, a new campaign was being whispered from cell to cell. A war, not of armies, but of steel and sleepers. That summer, a directive was issued from Moscow's partisan headquarters. It called for a rail war, a coordinated strike on the enemy's transport arteries from Belarus to the Baltic coast. Every bridge, every rail junction, every telegraph pole was to become a target. The order reached the Baltic states through partisan couriers and sympathetic officers of the underground, many of whom had been driven into the woods after the 1941 invasion. For them, the campaign gave purpose and permission to escalate. The message was simple: cripple the rails, and you cripple the Reich. The strategy was both practical and psychological. The Germans relied on trains for nearly every aspect of their war effort. Roads were poor, rivers unreliable, and aircraft stretched thin. A single freight train could carry more ammunition than an entire column of trucks. By attacking railways, partisans could multiply their impact. One explosion could stop dozens of trains, strand entire divisions, and force the enemy to guard hundreds of miles of vulnerable track. In Estonia and Latvia, resistance organizers adapted the Soviet blueprint to their fragmented terrain. There would be no large formations, no massed attacks. Instead, small cells, 5 to 10 people at most, would work independently, guided by local knowledge. Forest workers, hunters, and even railway clerks joined the effort. Some had access to detonators and explosives from abandoned depots. Others improvised with stolen grenades and black powder from logging sites. Each cell chose its own target, knowing that coordination was dangerous in a world where a single betrayal could destroy them all. For the Germans, the threat was both invisible and extensive. The first wave of sabotage was small. A telegraph line severed near Tartu, a bridge damaged south of Vilnius, a locomotive derailed in a bog near Jelgava. Reports trickled into the Wehrmacht's transport command, dismissed at first as accidents or negligence. But when delays began cascading through the system, when trains stopped arriving at frontline depots in Pskov and Narva, Berlin took note. New regulations demanded armed guards on trains, curfews near all tracks, and the execution of any civilian found within 50 meters of a railway after dark. These measures slowed nothing. The saboteurs adapted. They studied timetables, learned the habits of patrols, and struck where the forest pressed closest to the line. Explosives were planted at weak points, switches, channels, bridge supports, where damage would take the longest to repair. Often, they worked with little more than instinct and a watch. A single minute could mean life or death. Too early, and the blast was wasted. Too late, and the saboteurs were caught in the shockwave. By late 1943, the sabotage had grown into something larger. The Soviet command named it Operation Concert, an effort to coordinate rail attacks across occupied Europe in harmony, like instruments in an orchestra. In the Baltic sector, the forest cells played their part. Trains carrying ammunition from Germany to the front lines near Leningrad were derailed in succession. The Germans found themselves repairing the same sections of track again and again, only for them to be destroyed once more. It was not simply the material damage that hurt, it was the uncertainty. No officer could predict which train would make it through. The partisans took pride in that unpredictability. They learned to use the environment itself as a weapon. When snow muffled footsteps, they moved silently through drifts. When the rain softened the ground, they buried mines beneath the mud. In spring, melting ice flooded the lowlands, making it impossible for heavy repair crews to reach damaged bridges. Every season offered a new advantage to those who knew the land, yet the campaign was far from easy. Supplies were insufficient. Explosives were smuggled from Soviet lines or scavenged from old battlefields. Many missions failed before they began. A missed connection, a broken fuse, a German patrol arriving minutes too soon, each could doom a cell. Still, success stories spread faster than fear. Tales of derailed trains, of German officers raging at vanished enemies, gave courage to others. The resistance was learning that disruption itself was victory. For the German command, the situation grew intolerable. Rail officers in Riga and Tallinn demanded more troops to guard the lines, but reinforcements were scarce. Entire engineer battalions were tied up repairing tracks instead of building fortifications at the front. A report from late 1943 complained that enemy saboteurs have turned the rails into a second battlefield. Every new guard post consumed manpower. Every delay tightened the noose around the Reich's dwindling supply network. Still, the German response was methodical. Armored trains were deployed, bristling, with machine guns and carrying repair crews. Local informants were recruited through threats and promises. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned, but repression bred resistance. In the smouldering aftermath of each raid, more locals joined the saboteurs, trading safety for vengeance. The War of Rails had become self-sustaining, a cycle of damage, repair, and retaliation that drew deeper into the forest with every month. Late in the year, a Lithuanian cell received intelligence that a heavily loaded train would pass through a narrow bridge near Šiauliai carrying ammunition bound for the front. The operation was risky. German guards now patrolled the bridge day and night. But the cell decided to act. For days, they observed from the tree line, noting the times, the watch rotations, and the bridge's shadows under moonlight. On the appointed night, they crept forward, planting explosives under the central span before retreating into the reeds. When the train arrived, its whistle broke the forest silence, and then the bridge exploded into flame. The wreckage blocked the line for days. Supplies piled up for miles behind it. The success came at a cost. The Germans launched sweeping reprisals across nearby villages, arresting dozens, executing several, on suspicion of aiding the saboteurs. Yet for the resistance, the impact was undeniable. The rail war had proven its potential. German officers now referred to entire sectors as unstable zones. Timetables collapsed into chaos, and among the partisans, confidence grew that even small cells could bend the course of the war, one stretch of rail at a time. In the months that followed, coordination tightened. Couriers linked separate groups, passing coded reports of damage and German troop movements. Civilian collaborators expanded their roles, supplying maps, fuel, and clothing. The sabotage was no longer scattered defiance, it was becoming a system, a hidden infrastructure within an occupied land. But with every success, German counterintelligence grew sharper. The forests were no longer entirely safe. Patrols ventured deeper, aided by local informers, hunting the networks that had turned their rails against them. The next phase of the struggle would depend not only on explosives, but on endurance, the will to survive in a landscape where every path might lead to betrayal. And in those dark woods, the lines between soldier, civilian, and saboteur would blur beyond recognition. Through the long winter of 1943, the Baltic forests became both fortress and prison. The snow fell heavily, muffling the world into silence, yet beneath that quiet, the partisans moved. They were no longer isolated saboteurs striking by instinct. Now, they were bound by the fragile threads of a growing network, a resistance built not on numbers or firepower, but on trust. Hidden beneath the canopy, small partisan camps dotted the landscape. A few were remnants of pre-war soldiers who had escaped capture. Others were farmers, teachers, and railway workers who had slipped into the woods after German reprisals. Their lives were precarious. Tents stitched from tar paper, food stolen or bartered, radios powered by scavenged batteries. In each camp, the rhythm of survival merged with the rhythm of sabotage. Every successful attack on the rails depended on civilians who lived close enough to see the movement of trains, to overhear German orders, or to pass on rumors from station depots. These supporters, often unarmed and unacknowledged, formed the veins of the resistance. A washerwoman at a railway office might notice when guards were rotated. A farmer could lend his cart to carry explosives disguised beneath sacks of grain. A village priest might warn when patrols were coming. Each small act, insignificant alone, built a web strong enough to choke a military empire. In Estonia, networks began to coalesce around the so-called Forest Brothers, men and women who had fled into the pine woods rather than serve the occupiers. At first, their goals were survival, but by 1943, they had aligned with the wider partisan effort, trading intelligence with Soviet agents and conducting raids on supply lines. In Latvia, similar groups sprang up near Cēsis and Limbaži, where rail lines cut through dense forest and marsh. In Lithuania, partisans clustered around the Švenčionys and Utena forests, territories of shifting control, where Soviet, German, and nationalist cells overlapped uneasily. Communication was the lifeblood of these operations. Couriers, often young women or teenage boys, moved between towns and camps, carrying handwritten notes hidden in shoe soles or hollowed bread loaves. Messages were short, coded, and expendable. Bridge sick, doctor needed, meant a span was ready to be destroyed. Few couriers lasted long. If captured, they were interrogated brutally. Yet, many volunteered regardless. The resistance relied on their courage more than on any weapon. The forests themselves offered protection, but demanded constant movement. German patrols, learning from past failures, began using dogs and skis to sweep the undergrowth in widening arcs. Partisans responded with decoys, false trails, smoke fires, or logs arranged to resemble campfires seen from a distance. In winter, footprints betrayed them. In spring, thawing ground left tracks visible for days. Some cells survived by splitting into pairs, never meeting in full except when planning a strike. German counter-sabotage grew sophisticated. Armored trains now patrolled the main lines, each carrying guards and repair crews. Bridges were wired with alarms, telegraph lines doubled with decoys. Still, no amount of steel could seal the forest. The partisans adapted again, learning to time their attacks during blizzards, when visibility collapsed and guards sheltered from the cold. A single blast in the storm could cripple a section of track for a week, while repair crews struggled through knee-deep snow to reach it. Life in the camps was fragile. Food came from sympathetic villagers, smuggled through night paths, or left at marked trees. Illness was constant: frostbite, typhus, hunger. Yet morale endured, buoyed by word of successful strikes. One Estonian fighter recalled hearing of a derailment near Narva. "We had no bread that day, but when we heard the train had burned, we felt full." Such sentiments reveal what official records omit: the deep psychological power of resistance amid despair. Civilians bore the heaviest cost. When rail sabotage occurred, German authorities imposed collective punishments. Entire villages were fined or deported to forced labor. Fields were burned in reprisal. Yet, even under terror, cooperation persisted. Some villagers found quiet ways to resist, misdirecting German patrols, delaying timber deliveries, and claiming ignorance when questioned. Others paid with their lives. The resistance was not built on ideology alone. It was built on shared suffering and the refusal to yield. Throughout 1944, the networks grew more organized. Radio operators linked Baltic partisans to Soviet liaison units farther east. Supply drops, rare but vital, provided real explosives and new detonators. The raids became bolder. Entire sections of track were destroyed overnight. Bridges collapsed into rivers, and telegraph poles were felled in long chains of sabotage. Yet every victory deepened the risk. The Germans now viewed the forests themselves as hostile territory, a green enemy stretching from the Gulf of Finland to the Lithuanian border. Among the partisans, survival meant invisibility. Camps were dismantled after each operation. No campfire burned twice in the same place. Caches of weapons were buried under fallen logs or submerged in forest ponds. The partisans learned to read the land as others read books. Broken branch, a line of smoke, the faint pattern of wheels in mud. They were, as one German officer grudgingly wrote, ghosts who know every tree better than we know our own barracks. Still, ghosts could be hunted. In spring 1944, a German security sweep near Valmiera uncovered one of the largest Latvian resistance camps. Several leaders were captured. Others fled deeper into the bogs. Within weeks, new cells reformed. The forest absorbed loss the way it absorbed sound, quietly, completely, without complaint. By late spring, intelligence reports described significant enemy disruption along every major Baltic rail artery. The resistance had achieved what seemed impossible, turning a handful of villagers and soldiers into a logistical nightmare for one of the world's most mechanized armies. But inside the woods, no one spoke of victory. They knew the Germans would strike back harder and soon. One courier wrote in her last note before disappearing, "We have no lines, no fronts, only paths. But each path leads to the rails." It was both a description and a prophecy, for as the war turned against Germany in 1944, those paths would become the arteries of retreat, and the saboteurs who had once struck cautiously would find their moment to cripple the enemy in motion. And when that moment came, the forest would erupt again, not in whispers. Spring 1944 arrived early in the Baltics, the snow retreating to the hollows of the pines, leaving the ground soft and the rivers swollen. For months, the partisans had waited for this moment, the season, when movement was possible again, when frozen rails could be bent and bridges could burn. The German front in the east was contracting under relentless Soviet pressure, and through the Baltic forests ran the arteries that kept that front alive. Ammunition, oil, and men all depended on the rails. The saboteurs knew it, and so did their enemy. On a moonless night outside Šiauliai, a cell of 6 partisans crouched near a narrow bridge spanning a flooded ravine. They had watched the line for a week, studying guard shifts and the rhythm of the trains. Every night at roughly 2 o'clock, a supply convoy thundered across that bridge, bound for the northern front. Beneath the roar of the locomotives, the partisans had buried their charges, small bundles of explosives wired into the bridge's steel girders. Tonight, the detonator would complete the circuit. The minutes stretched long. The men lay in the mud, breath shallow, watching the faint shimmer of the tracks. Then, the tremor came, a distant, rhythmic vibration, growing stronger with each second. The train emerged from the trees, its headlight a single white eye. The leader counted silently. 1, 2, 3. On the 5th axle, he pressed the trigger. The explosion split the night in two. The bridge swayed, twisted, and collapsed into two, the ravine. Cargo cars tumbled after it, spilling crates, oil drums, and burning coal into the water below. The sound carried for miles through the forest, followed by silence, and then, in the distance, the first answering gunfire from startled German guards. By dawn, the partisans were gone, swallowed by the woods. That attack, later chronicled in scattered German reports, halted traffic along the line for nearly a week. Repair crews were forced to reroute supply trains hundreds of kilometers south. It was one of the most successful Baltic sabotage actions of the year, yet its true power lay not in the destruction itself, but in the lesson it taught, that even in retreat, the Reich's machinery could be paralyzed by a few determined hands in the forest. Elsewhere across the region, similar scenes played out. In Estonia, near the town of Tapa, partisans derailed an ammunition train by removing a short section of track just before dawn. The wreck burned for 2 days, its smoke visible for miles. In Latvia, saboteurs cut telegraph lines along a 30-kilometer stretch, forcing the Germans to dispatch entire communication battalions to restore them. Each act was small in isolation, but together they created a sense of siege. The forest itself seemed to rise against the occupier. For the partisans, every mission began with patience. Preparation could take weeks, scouting terrain, mapping escape routes, and waiting for weather that masked sound and light. They worked with improvised tools, axes for sleepers, chisels for bolts, stolen explosives shaped from discarded shells. Timing was everything. Too early, and the explosion might pass under an empty car. Too late, and the team might be trapped. They relied on instinct and the rhythm of the rails, learned from nights of listening to trains echo through the pines. But the greater danger came after the blast. The German response was swift and brutal. Security units sealed villages, interrogated residents, executed suspected collaborators. Forests were combed by dogs and searchlights. Armored trains rolled through the smoke, firing into the trees at random. Sometimes there were no saboteurs left to catch. They had already melted into the swamps or crossed into Soviet lines. But reprisals fell regardless. The price of every victory was measured in innocent blood. Still, the attacks multiplied. Reports from the Wehrmacht's Transport Command in mid-1944 described a paralysis of supply routes through the Baltic provinces. German officers complained that each bridge destroyed required weeks to rebuild, due to material shortages and the constant threat of new strikes. Crews began to work only in daylight, protected by armed escorts. Freight piled up at depots, bottlenecks forming at junctions like Daugavpils and Vilnius. The same rails that had once symbolized German control now testified to its fragility. Among the saboteurs, success brought both pride and fear. Knew their names were spreading through the German intelligence network. Bounties were posted for captured leaders. Yet morale surged. Soviet liaison officers reported that the Baltic partisans had disrupted thousands of tons of military supplies in a matter of months. Though no single explosion could decide the war, together they forced the German command to divert troops and engineers away from the front lines, an invisible contribution to the broader collapse. But the line between resistance and survival blurred dangerously. In villages near the forests, civilians faced impossible choices. Some aided the partisans out of conviction, others under pressure, and still others simply to protect their families. To the Germans, all were guilty. When a sabotage occurred near a village, punishment was collective: burned barns, deported families, vanished men. The forest became both shield and curse. It protected the saboteurs, but condemned those who lived at its edge. Amid this tension, the partisans faced moral fatigue. The destruction of trains brought delight but also guilt. They knew what followed: arrests, hangings, reprisals. Some questioned whether the cost was worth it, yet retreat was impossible. Each act of defiance had committed them more deeply to the struggle. "If we stop," one fighter wrote in his diary, "they will come for us anyway. Better to burn the rails than to wait on them." The Germans escalated further. They began building decoy trains, empty convoys used to draw saboteurs into ambushes. They mined sections of track with booby traps, leaving explosive charges in dismantled rails. Even approaching a line became a gamble. Still, the partisans adapted, studying blast marks, learning which sections were traps and which were safe to strike. Their war had become a chess match played across the occupied terrain. Then came one of the most daring operations of all. In June 1944, as Soviet forces advanced toward the Baltic, a partisan cell near Valga targeted a German supply train carrying fuel for retreating units. Using stolen uniforms and forged papers, they infiltrated a small maintenance depot, pretending to be railway laborers sent from another district. Under the cover of a routine inspection, they replaced several bolts on a curved section of track with hollowed ones packed with explosive powder. That night, the train passed over the curve and vanished in a roar of fire. The blaze lit the sky for hours. German reinforcements sent to investigate found only twisted metal and blackened ground. It was a triumph and a signal. Word of the attack spread through the resistance like wind through the trees. If the partisans could strike so deeply within the German system, perhaps the occupiers were not invincible after all. But victory was fleeting. Within days, German security forces launched a massive counter-operation across northern Latvia, sweeping the forests with artillery and aircraft. Camps were burned, caches discovered. Dozens of fighters were killed or captured. The survivors scattered once more into the wetlands, carrying what little ammunition remained. The forest grew silent again, its paths littered with the scars of both triumph and loss. Yet the silence was deceptive. The saboteurs were regrouping, not retreating. For as the German front began to crumble, the rails that had carried conquest eastward would now bear retreat westward. The next phase of the struggle would not be about stopping supplies, but about trapping an army in flight. And when that time came, the forests would become not just a hiding place, but a closing fist around the rails of retreat. By the summer of 1944, the German front lines across Eastern Europe were collapsing. Operation Bagration had torn open the heart of Army Group Center, and the shockwaves reached deep into the Baltic states. Trains that once carried reinforcements eastward now thundered west, packed with wounded men, supplies, and whatever machinery could be salvaged from the retreat. The same rails that had served as the arteries of conquest were becoming the lifelines of escape, and the saboteurs of the Baltic forests knew it. The change was sudden but unmistakable. Where once the resistance had struck to delay a supply train, now every explosion threatened to trap entire divisions. The forest networks moved quickly, adapting their missions to the new reality. In Latvia and Lithuania, partisan scouts charted the routes of retreating German convoys. They watched for bridges that could not be easily bypassed, for narrow embankments where derailment meant days of blockage. Each observation fed into a growing plan to turn retreat into disarray. For the German Logistics Command, the picture was desperate. Railways across the Baltics were overwhelmed. Engines broke down from overuse, fuel was scarce, and repair crews were stretched thin. The terrain offered little help. Marshes swallowed temporary tracks, and forest roads turned to mud after rain. The more the Wehrmacht pulled back, the longer its rail lines became, twisting through forests already crawling with saboteurs. Every kilometre of track demanded guards, and every guard was one less man for the crumbling front. In this chaos, partisan action surged. Around Daugavpils, Lithuanian and Latvian cells coordinated attacks that cut key bridges across the Daugava River. To the north, Estonian fighters near Tartu targeted junctions critical for the evacuation of fuel depots. Reports from German engineers described a continuous loss of material and time, noting that each bridge destroyed delayed traffic for up to a week. The rail war had reached its peak not as a series of scattered strikes, but as a sustained paralysis. But sabotage was no longer the work of small, isolated groups. The forests had become networks of intelligence. Civilians near the lines served as spotters, counting trains and noting directions. Telegraph lines were tapped to intercept orders. Some partisans even disguised themselves as repair workers, slipping explosives into toolboxes or planting charges while pretending to fix damaged rails. In the confusion of retreat, uniforms mattered less than confidence. Many Germans no longer knew who truly served whom. As attacks multiplied, the Wehrmacht tried to restore order through brutal efficiency. Engineer units worked day and night, guarded by armed detachments. Where bridges had been blown, makeshift trestles were thrown together from felled timber. To speed repairs, German officers began recruiting local villagers en masse. Under threat of execution, farmers and railway workers were forced to rebuild what they had secretly helped destroy. It was a grim symmetry. The same hands that laid new rails by day sometimes returned at night to sabotage them again. The forest saboteurs used everything the terrain had to offer. They mined channels to flood embankments, felled trees across tracks, and ambushed repair crews from concealed positions. The goal was not total destruction, but constant disruption, to make the Germans doubt every rail, every crossing, every bridge. Many attacks were timed to coincide with Soviet advances, forcing German divisions to halt just as the front collapsed behind them. A few hours' delay could decide whether an entire regiment escaped or was surrounded. The toll on civilians grew unbearable. Each act of sabotage invited retaliation. Villages burned, hostages taken, executions carried out in public squares. Families were uprooted as German troops scorched the countryside behind them. Yet the resistance did not waver. By now, they knew the war's direction. The Red Army was coming from the east, and though many feared a second occupation, they would not stop striking until the Germans were gone. German records from late 1944 speak of constant interference from irregular bands and untenable supply conditions. One transport officer lamented that the line exists only in theory. Each night it disappears. Even when tracks were repaired, traffic slowed to a crawl. Armored trains fired blindly into the forest as they moved, wasting ammunition on shadows. Fuel shortages compounded the misery. Locomotives sat idle, while stranded soldiers trudged west on foot along the very rails that had once carried their victory. By October, retreat had turned to flight. Soviet forces approached Riga, and the last German formations began withdrawing toward Courland. The Partisans, now in communication with advancing Soviet units, redoubled their efforts. In one coordinated strike near Jelgava, resistance fighters destroyed 2 bridges within hours of each other, severing the last direct rail connection to the coast. German command ordered repairs immediately, but the materials never arrived. The rails had vanished into the forest mud. Those final months blurred into exhaustion. For the saboteurs, victory was bittersweet. The rails they destroyed had once carried occupation. Now, they carried its collapse. Many of the men and women who fought in the forests did not live to see the liberation they had hastened. Others emerged from the woods to find their villages burned or emptied. Yet, for all the ruin, they had achieved what few thought possible. They had turned the empire's own infrastructure against it. When the Germans finally surrendered in May 1945, the forests of the Baltics were littered with rusted rails, wrecked bridges, and abandoned locomotives. To the outside world, these were symbols of defeat. To those who had fought among the trees, they were something more a silent testimony that even in the smallest corners of a vast war, resistance could find its own kind of victory. The railway lines lay twisted and broken, stretching west into the haze of retreat. But the saboteurs who had lived and died in their shadow understood what the ruins meant. The forest had endured, and as the smoke cleared over the wreckage of retreating armies, the Baltic rails, once symbols of occupation, had become monuments to defiance. The war on the rails was ending, but its memory was only beginning to gather steam. When the gunfire finally faded from the Baltic forests in May 1945, the sound that returned first was the quiet clatter of tools on metal. The war was over, but the rails twisted, scorched, and broken still lay across the land like scars. For those who had lived and fought among them, the silence felt strange. The forests that once echoed with explosions and pursuit were now filled with the distant creak of hammers and the hum of rebuilding. For months, teams of workers, civilians, prisoners of war, and returning Soviet engineers spread through the countryside to repair the network that had been the lifeline of war. Many of the same villagers who had sabotaged the rails now helped to rebuild them, this time under a new authority. In Estonia, the first trains to move again carried reconstruction materials toward Tallinn. In Latvia, they carried Soviet occupation troops. In Lithuania, the sound of the locomotive whistle announced both liberation and loss. The rails had survived, but the freedom for which many had fought had not come as they imagined. The partisans who emerged from the forests faced a transformed world. Some were welcomed as heroes by local communities that remembered their defiance. Others were denounced as enemies by the new Soviet administration. The Soviet state, eager to claim credit for the rail war, recast many of the Baltic sabotage operations as extensions of its own partisan command. Records were rewritten. Independent resistance blurred into official propaganda. The story of the rail saboteurs was no longer theirs alone. For many fighters, survival meant silence. Former partisans who had once targeted the Germans now found themselves pursued by Soviet security forces. Some fled west, others hid again in the same forests that had sheltered them before. The Forest Brothers, as they came to be known in post-war years, waged a quieter war of endurance this time against Moscow's rule. Their rail sabotage of 1943 and 1944 became the early chapter in a much longer struggle for Baltic independence. Still, traces of the original campaign remained everywhere. Along forgotten branch lines, rusting bridge girders leaned into rivers where explosives had once torn through steel. In villages, locals could still point to where trains had burned or where German patrols had marched after reprisals. Some kept fragments of rail or shrapnel as keepsakes, hidden in barns or buried beneath floorboards. The official histories ignored these relics, but in family stories they carried a quiet weight, reminder of what it had cost to resist. By the 1950s, the new Soviet governments had rebuilt and expanded much of the railway system. In official ceremonies, these rails symbolized progress and unity under socialism. The earlier sabotage campaigns were acknowledged only when they fit the Soviet narrative. Acts performed under communist leadership, part of the grand, patriotic war. The local, nationalist, or purely civilian elements of resistance were erased from the record. To speak of independent action, or of those who fought for freedom beyond ideology, was dangerous. Memory itself became a battlefield, yet not all memory can be buried. In Estonia and Latvia, veterans met quietly in forest clearings to mark the anniversaries of the great derailments. In Lithuania, villagers tended unmarked graves along the rail embankments. Even as the regime tightened its control, stories continued to pass in whispers, how the rails had been cut, how trains had burned, how ordinary people had defied an empire with nothing but courage and the cover of trees. When independence returned decades later, those memories resurfaced. In the 1990s, historians began piecing together the forgotten record of the Baltic Rail War. Archives yielded fragmentary reports, German incident logs, partisan diaries, scattered Soviet dispatches. The picture that emerged was incomplete but powerful. Small groups operating under impossible odds, using their intimate knowledge of forest and rail to wound a vast machine of occupation. Their sabotage had not decided the war, but it had forced the occupier to bleed time, fuel, and fear. Today, traces of that struggle remain hidden in plain sight. In Latvia, a memorial near Jelgava marks a rebuilt bridge destroyed by partisans in 1944. In Lithuania, a section of preserved track runs through a forest where the rails were once blown apart, the metal still darkened by old explosions. School groups visit these places now, learning not just of the war's battles, but of its smaller acts of defiance, the ones fought in silence, in shadows, without medals or flags. The meaning of those actions continues to evolve. To some, the rail saboteurs represent the birth of Baltic resistance, the proof that independence never truly died. To others, their legacy is complicated by the tangled loyalties of a war fought between two occupying powers. But perhaps their truest legacy lies not in politics or propaganda, but in endurance, the refusal to let occupation become normal, the insistence that even the most ordinary tool, a stretch of track through a forest, could become a weapon of will. As the years pass, the forests reclaim more of the old lines, moss grows over the sleepers, and birch roots curl around the rails. The sound of trains no longer echoes there, but sometimes, on quiet evenings, villagers still say they hear a faint metallic ring carried through the trees. The war of rails has long ended, yet its memory runs beneath the surface like buried iron waiting to be found again. And so, in the hush of the Baltic woods, the past hums faintly underfoot, its story etched not on paper, but in steel that once defied an empire. Chapter 7. Lessons in Logistics, Forest Warfare, and Resistance. In every great war, victory often depends not on the generals or the grand offensives, but on the unseen arteries that keep armies alive. In the Baltic forests, The War of the Rails revealed this truth with brutal clarity. Here, on the narrow tracks threading through pine and swamp, the struggle for logistics became a struggle for survival. The partisans who sabotaged those lines understood something the high commands sometimes forgot. An empire moves on rails, and rails can break. The German occupation had been built on movement coal, ammunition, rations, troops. Every length of steel track carried the illusion of control across conquered lands. Yet, the Baltic landscape turned that strength into vulnerability. The forests hid enemies who could strike anywhere and vanish before dawn. The marshes slowed repair crews. The winters froze engines solid. Logistics, once the lifeline of war, became a constant gamble. For every train that reached its destination, another never arrived. The saboteurs themselves drew lessons that extended beyond war. They learned that resistance did not always need armies or front lines. It needed patience, knowledge of terrain, and the courage to act in small, relentless ways. A single bolt loosened at the right time, a section of wire cut in darkness. These were not grand gestures, yet they multiplied across thousands of kilometers into something larger than the sum of their parts. The Rail War was proof that persistence could wound power even when weapons were few. Historians later debated how much these actions truly altered the German retreat. Some Soviet reports claimed enormous results, thousands of trains destroyed, divisions delayed for weeks. Modern research is more cautious, suggesting that many figures were inflated or drawn from other regions of the Eastern Front. Yet even conservative estimates agree that the psychological effect was immense. For the German occupation authorities, the Baltics had become a haunted landscape. No rail, no bridge, no depot could be trusted. Every journey carried the weight of fear. Equally lasting were the lessons in how resistance movements functioned under extreme conditions. The Baltic networks thrived because they were decentralized. Each cell operated independently, guided only by a common purpose and familiarity with the terrain. There were no radios in most camps, no central command to expose under interrogation. When one group fell, another continued elsewhere. This resilience, born of necessity, foreshadowed the guerrilla strategies that would shape resistance movements around the world long after 1945. But the story of the rail saboteurs also warns against myth. In later decades, their legacy was often simplified into heroism, brave patriots blowing up enemy trains. The truth was harder. For every successful blast, there were failures, betrayals, and reprisals. Civilians paid dearly. Whole villages vanished from maps. The moral weight of resistance was heavy, carried quietly by those who survived. It was not a tale of glory, but of endurance, the courage to keep fighting when victory was neither certain nor clean. And yet, there is something universal in their defiance. The forests of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania became classrooms of resistance, teaching that occupation can be fought not only with rifles, but with the very infrastructure that sustains it. The saboteurs turned technology against its masters. Rails, engines, and timetables became instruments of disruption. In this inversion lies a timeless lesson, that even the machinery of power contains the seeds of its own undoing when confronted by those who refuse to submit. Comparisons can be drawn to other resistance theatres: Poland's Home Army cutting telegraph lines, the French Maquis blowing tunnels in the Alps, the Belarusian partisans waging their own rail war under Soviet direction. Yet the Baltic struggle remains distinct. It was smaller, quieter, but no less determined. It unfolded in landscapes where loyalties blurred and survival meant adaptation. These were not professional soldiers, but villagers, loggers, students, and railway clerks. Ordinary people who turned their knowledge of land and steel into an unconventional weapon. By the war's end, they had achieved more than they knew. The Germans, forced to commit thousands of men to guard the rails, lost flexibility when they needed it most. Divisions trapped during the retreat through the Baltic corridor owed their fate partly to the constant harassment of supply routes. Even as the great battles unfolded far away, the ripples of the Forest War reached them. Logistics, not just firepower, shaped the outcome of nations. Today, as freight trains hum once more along rebuilt lines, the lesson endures in subtler form. Railways remain symbols of connection, but also of vulnerability. Every nation that depends on infrastructure understands, consciously or not, what the Baltic saboteurs once proved: that control of movement is control of destiny, and that those who know the terrain, its rivers, woods, and roads, hold a kind of power no army can easily crush. In museums and memorials across the Baltics, photographs of wrecked trains and forest fighters now hang beside restored rails polished to a gleam. School children walk the paths where saboteurs once crawled through mud. Guides tell them that these forests witnessed not just destruction, but the stubborn will to act when action seemed impossible. The story is no longer one of vengeance or ideology. It is one of resilience, of a people who learned to fight with what they had, where they stood. As the light fades through the tall birches and the rails hum softly with the passing of a distant freight, the echoes of that older struggle linger. The saboteurs are gone, their camps reclaimed by moss and time, yet their legacy runs deeper than the forest floor. It lies in the idea that resistance is not measured by scale, but by spirit, the quiet conviction that even the smallest hand, set against tyranny, can move the weight of an empire. And so the rails of the Baltic, once forged for conquest, came to stand for something greater: the endurance of those who refused to let history pass them by in silence. The war may have ended, but its lessons still travel the lines we built afterward. History still speaks through the ruins and rails of the past.